Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. Our podcast was started to cover three topics. First is innovation around energy, both within the School of Energy Resources and with our partners across the University of Wyoming and around the state and beyond. And the second was just to really provide information on what's happening in the energy sector in Wyoming. And then third, the topic that's really near and dear to my heart also is leadership. And good leadership is so important to every aspect of energy and really every industry. So we'll be focused today on that third topic. We're talking to Doug Stark, who is also passionate about leadership. So Doug, for our listeners who may not know you, let's start by telling a little bit about your roots in Wyoming.
Well, thank you, Holly. It's great to be with you. Yeah, I'm from Wyoming. I was raised here. Went to school and graduated at Riverton, and then didn't come to college right out of high school, but I found my way here at the university. I got a degree in agricultural business, ended up in the finance world, and the first half of my career I spent in Wyoming in the finance world, and then I had the opportunity to go into the executive team at Farm Credit Services of America as chief credit officer, and then spent the last 13 years as the CEO. So a lot of different experiences and a lot of insights that I gained over the time. But even though while we lived in Nebraska for a period of time, our hearts were always in Wyoming. We knew we'd be back, and we are. Now we farm and ranch here, and we're loving it.
Great. So you were at Farm Credit Services America for 37 years in your career, and you ended, as you just said, as CEO. And just some statistics. So under your leadership, the financial cooperatives assets grew from $9.7 billion to $25.8 billion. And net income grew from $144 million to $514 million. So those are really great. That shows that a lot of growth, and being a cooperative means a lot of good things happening in the community, a lot of service. So talk about the challenges you faced during your time and how you overcome those, and maybe also how did you lead the organization to see such successful times?
Yeah. Okay, Holly. That's interestingly enough, when I was chosen to be the CEO at Farm Credit Service America, ironically, we had an unsustainable business model. And it was maybe a part of my vision for the organization that I talked with the board with in that selection process. But we were high cost, we had low margins, we had high growth, and as a result, we were putting stresses on our capital. In addition, the board wanted to start paying dividends. So that cash flow then was another need. And so we had to reinvent the way we did business. And so the bottom line was, how do you do that in a pretty traditional world that finance is a part of? And ironically, I had been working on that in my previous role prior to becoming CEO. So we really leveraged that work, and we just totally revamped our model. We specialized extensively, and we used and leveraged technology, particularly data and analytics, to develop a proprietary decision tool for our lending practices, to the point where to give you an example, it used to take us days and weeks to make loan decisions, to where 75% of our loan decisions, when we got all said and done with this process, we made in less than 2 seconds.
Wow. That's incredible. And the level of efficiency, wow. So can you talk I think our listeners would be very familiar with cooperatives on the energy side, particularly rural electric co-ops. So talk about what is a financial agricultural co-op look like? Do you only lend to your members, and how are you? Talk about that a little bit.
No, our focus and our mission, and frankly our charter, was restricted us to financing agriculture from top to bottom.
Okay.
So from the farmers clear up through agribusinesses and production, including the energy sector to a degree where you had ag and energy intersecting through biodiesel and ethanol.
Oh, great. Yeah. So of course you're not going to get off the hook. This is run by the School of Energy Resources. So this podcast is always going to touch on energy. So biodiesel and ethanol is that the main crossover that you saw with the energy sector during your time?
Yeah, it was really the only place for us to be, given our focus and our charter limitations restricting us strictly to agriculture. So while I was there, first as chief credit officer and then as CEO, we really financed the build out of the ethanol industry. And so the Farm Credit System was a predominant lender to particularly ethanol, but to a lesser degree biodiesel. And so it was really an interesting journey all the way from trying to figure out what plants to finance. And it was all new at the time. So success rates were varied initially. We learned some hard lessons as well on how to be successful in lending to that industry. And again, we specialized and we hired people and focused them exclusively on the industry so they could be well informed on what the dynamics were.
That industry is still very much alive and well. So were most of those projects in Nebraska?
They're throughout the Midwest.
Midwest, yeah.
Yeah, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota. And then as you got out a little farther, Minnesota, Illinois, some in Kansas, a few here and there. But Wyoming really didn't have much participation in that ethanol space, as you know. It
doesn't, but interestingly, all the work Wyoming has done on things like CO2 storage are now going to be tied into the ethanol industry. So you never know how these areas will intersect. And now it's going to potentially, if some proposed projects that are moving forward now come to fruition, it's actually going to really benefit landowners who choose to lease their subsurface for CO2 storage in really the southeast part of the state. And all that's coming from ethanol. Maybe some projects that you originally financed.
It might be. It'll be interesting to see how that comes full circle.
Yeah, well. Okay, so let's shift from your career to one of the reasons the way I met you is you've really chosen to give back to your community, to UW, and let's focus on UW because you've done so much here, a number of capacities. So first of all, you facilitated collaboration on research and outreach between UW and the Farm Credit Services of America. And in the College of Ag Life Sciences and Natural Resources, you've taught a course and you've served on the Dean's Council. So first, talk about why you choose to use your time in this way and why you are driven to be so engaged.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. You know, I'm inspired by a Winston Churchill quote, which reads, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." And, you know, I'm at that stage in my career where I've been successful. We've done a lot of really great things, both from a career standpoint and as we talked about the successes with my company here just a minute ago. It's time for me to give back, and we do that both through time and treasures, if you want to look at it that way. So
absolutely.
We love to do that. You know, part of the reason I do it is I look back on my career, and it was probably halfway through my career before I really recognized the impact of leadership and that leadership can be learned. And I started learning some of the foundational skills of leadership, even though I had been in leadership positions for years. And so that's another reason. And I'm really grateful for the education that I received here at the University of Wyoming. It was not just another step in my process. As I mentioned, I didn't come to college right out of high school. So by the time I got here, which was only a couple years, I was pretty focused that there had to be a better life. And my time here at the University of Wyoming was really transformational for me. And it wasn't just another step in my education path. It was a game changer.
And did you take leadership classes while you were here?
No, that's ironically, that's one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing, because at the time there weren't any.
You know, Doug, you're not alone. There's, I think, other folks who, and I went to the University of Oklahoma, chemical engineer by training. I thought, I'm going to be honest, I thought leadership was fluff. And I'm probably about halfway through my career now. We'll see. We don't know. But it took a while before I started paying attention to this topic at all. And now I realize it's absolutely fundamental to being successful at any level is basic leadership practices. So there are now, I think there's growing recognition of that. And it's been really interesting to see people like yourself, other people who've had success in their career choose to come back and teach leadership from the perspective of someone who's implemented these things and who's learned it kind of on the job, which is how you learned it, how I learned it. But our students here at the University of Wyoming, they're going to have a foundation that's stronger than what we graduated with, right? So they might not be like me and spend the first 10 years thinking it's all fluff and then realizing, oh no, this really makes a big difference all of a sudden. So thank you for doing that. So what are your students learning in your leadership class?
Oh my goodness, Holly. This is really the fun part because, as you mentioned, I didn't get that opportunity. What I'm hoping to create is a conscious competence around leadership for these young people, just to open their minds and raise the awareness around leadership. It's my hope for each one of these students, at least that I get the opportunity to touch in our leadership classes, that I help make them a better person. And so if they're better people, they'll be better leaders and more effective personally. And so one of my personal goals, is to raise their competency around their personal effectiveness. And so there's a lot of things that we do in that regard. We help them think about their capabilities and even goals from a bigger perspective. And then we also help them develop a greater self-awareness about who they are and what their strengths are. I love in that regard, when you think about goals and accomplishments and look back on our careers, there's another, I love quotes, so there's another Michelangelo quote that I really like, and it goes, "The greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is high and we miss it, but it's too low and we reach it." And I just hope to unlock the potential in these young people because they have such bright futures if they just acknowledge and recognize what's in front of them.
I totally agree with that. There's something to be said. Sometimes it takes a while to gain the confidence you need to be successful. When you have all the talent you need the whole time, but it's just believing in yourself enough and kind of trusting that. So great points, and we'll get back to leadership. But I also want to hit on one more topic, an area where you're giving back. So you've been named interim director of UW's Ranch Management and Agricultural Leadership Program, which is, I like to say, RMAL.
Right.
So the School of Energy Resources and the College of Ag, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources, we've started really building our relationship and our collaboration. It's existed for a long time around topics like reclamation, but there's new areas where we're growing, including the academic programs that we both offer. So our students at SER, they take RMAL courses, and the associate director of RMAL, do you say RMAL?
Yes. That's
okay.
Right,
Okay.
Yeah.
He's the director of our energy and environmental science concentration. So by doing that, we've really tied our two units together, and it's just a part-time role for him, but it really helps us to understand what all is available that our students could be taking outside what we offer and taking advantages of courses like the one you offer. So hopefully our students can take advantage of that. So, and by the way, quick plug. So that associate director, his name's Randall Violet, and you can hear him on episode 28 if you want to learn more about that concentration, energy and environmental systems, and our degree. So does it surprise you, or what do you think about the fact that we're trying to build up that collaboration?
I think it's fantastic, Holly, and we should be doing more of this. I'm not surprised that it's occurring. And even as we look forward, we're building out the leadership curriculum in the RMAL program, and that's one of the big reasons I'm doing what I'm doing, and that Kelly Crane, the Dean of the College of Agriculture, Life Science, and Natural Resources, asked me to lead and to serve as the interim director, is to build out that leadership curriculum. So we had the one class that I taught this spring. I'm in the process of standing up 3 more classes.
Wow.
And so I'm hoping by the spring of 26, so next year, we'll have additional offerings, another upper level class, and then following that, we'll have 2 other more foundational leadership classes. So there's a great opportunity for your students to participate in our classes. They're open to anybody. And if we double or triple enrollment in our leadership curriculum, I'll be delighted.
Great. I have a lot of ideas we'll talk about offline. And that's what a great opportunity for our students. I think the other thing we're going to need to do is make sure we're marketing that across the university.
That's right. So. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move into just strictly talking about leadership and let's focus on your philosophy. So let's just start. How would you describe your approach to leadership?
Well, Holly, I firmly believe that leadership is about action and purpose, not title or position. And that's such a misnomer in our world today because people look at individuals with titles, positional titles as the leaders when they recognize and fail to recognize the role that everyone in the organization can play from a leadership perspective. So one of the courses that I taught at Farm Credit Services America, and I taught this even as CEO, every year I had multiple courses, was leadership is everyone's business. And essentially everyone in the company enrolled in that class, not because they had to, because they wanted to. It became one of the most popular classes in the company. And again, it was designed, as I mentioned earlier, to help them be better people and for them to recognize their role as a leader, regardless of what their position was in the organization.
So I want you to, can we go a little deeper on that? I want you to talk to me when I'm getting my first job and I'm an engineer and I have not heard of anything about leadership. And I certainly wouldn't think of myself a leader. I have no direct reports. I'm being brought in. My first job was to kind of build a CO2 capture program at a company that focused on emissions technologies for coal-fired power plants. So I'm sitting at my desk, brand new PhD student, have never really thought about leadership, not in a position with a fancy title. What would you say to me about how I have a role to play in leadership?
Well, first of all, new employees bring new ideas. And organizations, if they're really open-minded to innovation and change and making themselves better, will listen to new employees with these unique ideas. So I used to tell our team at Farm Credit Services of America, I've been with the company 37 years. The problem is I've been with the company 37 years.
Yeah.
So one of my strengths, and I knew the company inside and out, but I was so narrow in my scope of experience that when new employees come to our organization, they bring fresh ideas and thoughts that can make us even better. And it's up to leadership to acknowledge that and open up the avenues that new employees can step up and demonstrate their ideas and lead and incorporate them into whether it be a team or a process or a broader strategic application.
And so if you're one of those folks with the fancy title, it's really important that you create kind of an environment or a culture where those new folks feel comfortable to voice those ideas. Not every idea will be good, but they have to be willing to voice what they're thinking.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, you just got to create that environment and culture and be open to those things. And, I used to say, and whether it's new ideas or whether feedback is a gift. That was a common phrase in our organization, and to me personally as well as to the organization. So if, in fact, you have people that are offering feedback relative to current processes, then we need to listen.
Yeah.
Because in today's world, some of these young students coming in fresh out of college, and now with AI and everything else going on in technology applications, oh my goodness. And I would even speak from experience. So I'm not a techie person.
Okay.
Unfortunately. But even as CEO, I acknowledge the role that technology would play in the success of our organization. So while I wasn't the one that could teach anybody the technical applications or technical skills, I was the biggest cheerleader for how we might leverage those things. And they all knew it. They knew that I was behind them and supported them in that regard. And so oftentimes what happens is if you let people loose with those kind of ideas and you set a vision that this is what we want to be, they will make it even better than what you might have envisioned. It happened time and time again.
So you have 5 practices of leadership. Can you describe each one of those?
Yeah. One of the reasons I went into the corporate office to begin with, because I didn't really see myself as a corporate office kind of guy. I'm a grassroots, rural, grounded kind of person. And but the CEO, we had a new CEO come in, and he offered up this book called The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner. And that really became our disciple. I'm becoming a disciple of their practices. And they outline 5 practices of exemplary leaders that is based on 30 plus years of research. What I like about it is that it's research-based. It's not just somebody's idea or philosophy or the latest book title that they put into place. And they've got, you Google the Leadership Challenge and you'll find tons and tons of stuff out there. But the 5 practices of exemplary leaders, as they stated, are modeling the way, And we can talk a lot about that. I mean, it's all about trust. It's about integrity. It's about credibility, inspiring a shared vision so people know where you're going and can embrace it. Challenging the process, which is really about change. How do you drive change for a better world, if you want to call it that? Enabling others to act. So that's around eliciting commitment, not enforcing compliance. And encouraging the heart, which is one of the most powerful, giving recognition to those that really do a great job.
Okay, let's dial in on just one of those. So modeling the way. So can you talk about what you mean by that? What specifically?
Well, what I've learned and embraced from the teachings in this book, but probably as much as anything, what I've learned is it's all about integrity. It's about doing what you say you will do. And obviously, if you're a leader modeling the way, if you don't get this one right, you're not going to be effective as a leader. I can just tell you that from personal experience as well as practice. It's about building credibility. It's about accountability. It's about developing trust. And so all those things are really key components. And to me, it all revolves around integrity. Mm-hmm. And I love Alan Simpson's quote where he says, if you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
And so
he's the best.
The phrase that I've coined is it's integrity, first, last, and always.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's not a 90% thing. Either you have it or you don't. And you have to practice it ongoing. And so if I can go on here just another second.
Yeah.
So I had an executive coach tell me one time, he said, Doug, you have to be obsessed with honoring the integrity of your word. And I was kind of blown away by that statement because it was like, wow, this is way over the top. But his intent, and as we talked about, it was really true. I mean, you have to be really meticulous about making sure that every commitment you make, you honor. And if you don't, but life happens and
right.
Things change, but we all have these nice little things in our pockets called phones. Mm-hmm. And if something comes up, we can call or text and change our commitments and renegotiate them. But it's so important to make sure you follow through and do what you say you're going to do. It's the essence of leadership.
And I will say, I mean, sometimes you make a commitment and you can't meet it because of things that are outside of your control, which is probably one of the hardest times. And I think one of the reasons I continue to read leadership books is sometimes they give you the courage to admit that you failed or that admit you're wrong, as opposed to your first instinct is like, I don't want to look bad. I don't want my organization to look bad, but it's not the right thing. You know, sometimes you have to say like, I don't know, we asked for the wrong amount of money. We can't finish this project, and just be honest about what your problem is, because covering it up usually just leads to much bigger problems down the line and a loss of credibility. Right. Yeah. So, but I think that's one of the things where somehow just investing the time in leadership books helps me have you know what the right thing to do is, right? But you just have to have the backbone to do it. And so it helps me make sure that backbone's there.
Well, I applaud you for doing that, Holly, because you're practicing another one of the great aspects of leadership, and that's to be a lifelong learner and to continue to read and to some degree invent who you are on an ongoing basis, to look for ways to make yourself better on an ongoing basis. And that's really important in leadership. I did the same thing even while I was chosen to be CEO, and I was in that role for 13 years. I was a voracious reader of leadership books. If I would get one new idea out of a book read, I called it a success. And I always got at least one, and sometimes many more. And then I also engaged through the course of my tenure as CEO, executive coaches, and I found them to be very helpful, because not always can you go to your team with issues, particularly if they involve them, and you don't always want to go to your board with issues. Yeah. So it was really an outlet, and they also challenged me to think about my impact, my personal impact, and how I was coming across, how I showed up in these different situations. And it was really insightful for me to reflect upon my own actions as a leader and be more effective as I move forward.
I will say, we have actually some really great resources here in the state. So I am a graduate of Leadership Wyoming, and now they're setting up a new program where you can kind of get executive coaching or just have someone to talk to. Sometimes being in a leadership position can be really lonely. And like you say, it's hard to figure out who you can talk to. I think I'm lucky. I'm not at the top of the organization. So I have a great set of peers in the other deans, including Kelly Crane, who you've worked with a lot. And man, do we cover a lot of ground sometimes, just working through issues that are sometimes common and sometimes not common.
Right.
So that really helps a lot. But I definitely agree that you do need some support. So I want to ask another question because, it's really important in leadership to make sure your team kind of believes that you're not asking them to do anything that you wouldn't do. However, it's also, you can't do anyone else's job. So how do you balance that? You want to show you're a hard worker, but you need to also get out of the way. So what does that mean?
Well, I struggled with that, particularly early on in my transition, especially into the executive leadership roles, because I always felt that I had to handle alone and go through the same processes I expected everybody else to.
Yeah.
So the same thing you're talking about. It was incumbent upon me to roll up my sleeves and get dirt under my fingernails, just like they were doing. So I couldn't ask them to do anything that I wasn't willing to do myself. So that was one of my kind of early premonitions about leadership. But as I developed into executive roles, that just wasn't possible, as you mentioned. And frankly, I didn't have the skill sets then to complete some of the processes that were necessary in an organization. And I know every leader finds themselves in that position particularly in larger organizations. You just can't do the specialized tasks and activities that your team is required to do. But you can listen.
Yeah.
You can ask questions. So how's it going? What are you doing today? I'd often stop by and say, what do you got going on today? So are things running smoothly? What are your challenges in accomplishing your particular role or your job? And actually listen to them and not just blow them off, but say, okay, if there are, then let's figure out a way to get those issues on the table in some team setting to fix them or implement change. And so I think if people know you're listening and you're interested in them personally as well as in their job and their effectiveness, then you can overcome that.
Sometimes I think my team waits a while to tell me when there's issues because they know that if they tell me something that I'm going to jump in and they're going to try and solve it first. And sometimes I don't know, I can make a mess when I solve things. So, but I totally agree with everything you said. And I appreciate, you giving all your time to the students here and to me in this podcast. Were there any specific mentors or role models? Obviously, you have a whole book full of quotes that you're pulling. You don't have a book. for anyone listening, you're just pulling them out of your mind. But any mentors or role models who helped you shape your views on leadership?
Well, not really. Not a single one that I could say, here's a person I've always used over the course of my career to give me insights and advice about myself or leadership roles. I love to see and watch how people lead. Some are extraordinarily successful and impactful. Others are really, really bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the fact of the way it is. And you don't have to be in their organizations. I mean, we see it every day in business, and we see it every day as played out with their team and their business applications. And we see it every day in the public view, whether it be politics or a state government or wherever it may be. And I really like to watch them and think about what they're doing from a leadership perspective. And I learn from all of them. You see things that work well and see things that don't work well. And then, as you mentioned, I read. And as I also mentioned, I've had the benefit of executive coaches to really provide some of that mentorship and focus that were really helpful to me.
How did you find a good executive coach?
I interview them and I sit down and I'll usually get 2 or 3 names from folks that I know, and then I'll sit down and I'll say, I'm going to hire an executive coach and I'd like to talk to you about what you offer and how you approach your interactions with an executive. And I might interview a couple, or probably up to 3, and then I'll decide on somebody. But I had one the entire time, 13 years as CEO.
Wow.
I think there was almost always a time I had an executive coach.
And, I think the great thing is no matter what level you're at or your means, there's so many resources out there now. There's audiobooks. You can get free podcasts on leadership. I found one from Australia, which of course I couldn't find one without a swear word in the title. So I won't repeat it here, but you can look for it. But there's so many great options out there. So, and a lot of them are low and no cost. So part of being a leader is making difficult decisions. And so can you talk about how did you navigate that, especially when people or communities were going to be impacted by your decision?
Well, firstly, I don't believe any leader has to carry the responsibility of making a decision, even a tough decision, on their own.
Yeah.
Now, the accountability may rest with an individual leader to make some of those tough decisions, particularly if it's around personnel or even strategic focus or goals. But invite diverse points of view.
Yeah.
Seek out input from others. I think it's really important to do that. Not that you're asking them to make the decision, but you want to try to recognize the different aspects of what may be coming to your table to make a decision around. So, and I think you go back and reflect on the mission and stay true to your values. We all kind of know what the right thing to do is in a lot of cases, but it's hard pulling the trigger on tough decisions sometimes. And I think if you keep the mission and vision, the greater good of the organization in mind, seek input from others, and then probably another thing would be to test your assumptions on different issues. We oftentimes, we all have biases, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in a positive sense, is that we learn through growing up about different things. We have a tendency to do things a certain way and to look at the world in a certain way. And so I think testing your assumptions and not just doing what's comfortable or what you may be used to, you just got to get away from that. And so I think there's some basic premises there that can be really helpful.
So is that you, if you were CEO for 13 years, I could definitely see how you can fall into kind of doing things the same way. So you listen to young people and you used your team. Any other things that you did to try to make sure that you weren't getting too comfortable?
Yeah, we just did a number of things. Maybe, for example, we wanted to develop more innovation in our organization. So I took my executive team to Silicon Valley. And we spent a week in like 7 or 8 different companies out there that were not even related to finance. And what we wanted to learn was how to embed the process of innovation and the thinking, the philosophy around innovation into our company. So there's ways you can do things like that take some of the pressure off, so involve others, get ideas, reach outside even your industry to look for how things are done in other worlds that you can apply in your industry. So those have all been helpful to me to try to be helpful in making those course corrections or changes in direction. That's
pretty novel. There's a lot of governance boards that do have individuals from other industries for that very reason, but to take that initiative on the management side, that's not too common. That's pretty novel. So, okay. So then are there any specific challenges that you faced in your leadership role that you thought were particularly difficult, and how did you address that?
Well, ironically, some of the best things you can do in organizations are also some of the most challenging and the hardest. And so getting diverse opinions into a decision or into a process is really beneficial, but it takes more time.
Yeah.
So frankly, that could be somewhat frustrating for me because I like to see things move forward. But I would say in that light, so I assembled what I would call a pretty diverse executive team, particularly in the way they thought and approached issues and problems and opportunities. It was really hard to lead that team. But we always had one kind of standing rule. We'll decide when we have to make this decision. And at the end of that conversation, whether it's in an hour or whether it's a week or it's a month, we have to make that change or decision. If you can't all agree, then I will make the decision. So they knew the accountability rested with me. I will seek all your input. They usually always knew where I stood. And ironically, they never let that happen.
Really? I love that. I think the other thing that, what you really want at the end of the day, not everyone has to agree with the decision, right, and they probably won't. But if they muddled through and said their piece and listened to others, they may get to the point where at least they can openly be supportive. What you don't want is people who are blindsided by something on your leadership team pushing back. So that's another thing you avoid by having that group discussion as well.
Holly, I could tell you, even as CEO, there were some decisions that we made as a team that I personally wouldn't have done the way we did them. But the team come to that consensus, and I supported the team decision, and I walked out there and led it, even though it wouldn't have been the way I'd have done it. But I never invoked executive privilege to say, okay, my way is better than the team decision. I never did that.
Wow. So after all this time, everything you've learned, and surely you've thought about this when you were teaching students, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self, starting at the beginning of your career, maybe at the end of your education, or maybe at the beginning of your education, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, I love that question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question in that frame, and I don't think I've ever asked it to anybody either. So I would say, as I reflect back, and I was sharing with you earlier before we started the podcast, I've developed a set of kind of 10 to 12 thoughts and ideas and insights I've gained over the course of my career and experiences. One of them is take more risks.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to step out there. One of the things I observed with many of the farmers that we worked with was and I would go out and I visited thousands of farmers the time I was CEO. I love going out on their farms and having them tell me their stories. But they always told me about things they regretted not doing. They never told me about something that they did that they regretted. Mm-hmm. And I can look back on my own situation and say, and I don't know if it would have changed or I would have wanted it to change the trajectory of my career. But people oftentimes regret things they didn't do. They seldom regret things they've done.
Yeah.
And that usually evolves about, well, I was going to do that, or I wanted to do that, or I just was afraid to do it, or I didn't pull the trigger, or it got me out of my comfort zone. I mean, all those kind of things come into play, and they didn't take the action that they later wish they had of, and then the opportunity has passed them by.
So take more risk.
Take more risks.
Yeah. Great. So we always close asking our guests about something different and just really celebrating Wyoming and what an incredible place it is to live. So we always ask for our last question, what is your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
Well, I love the mountains. I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time over the years in the mountains, camping, fishing, hunting, and I just love the wilderness areas and just not just the national parks, but really the remote areas of Wyoming. So there's a couple places that really come to mind. So the Dry Creek drainage up south east of Du Bois is a special place. It's all wilderness. It's really hard to get into, really remote. I've taken my family there and others there from time to time. It's such a peaceful place. And I love that. And then the other place that's really meant a lot to me is we used to do a lot of hunting up around Leidy Lake and Leidy Peak, which overlooks, you can see the Tetons. It's kind of the uppermost peak east of the Tetons. It's right on top of the Continental Divide there. And just have great memories with some super friends and some just great experiences there. Those are two of my favorite places.
Great. We have a lot to enjoy here. And I've really enjoyed our time on this podcast. And I just want to thank you for all you do for the state, for the University of Wyoming, for our friends over at the College of Ag, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources. Thanks for meeting with me, and thanks for doing the podcast.
All right. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every other Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.